like now to continue with our discussion about the papacy and where the papacy comes from. So in the last lecture we talked about indications in early Christianity possibly telling us that there isn't a single bishop of bishops, or at least that this idea was not universally accepted by everyone. So how does the Pope come to be? How does the Bishop of Rome come to a place of having expanded influence and authority? So in this part I want to talk about some other factors. First of all, I want to think about some political factors. The way that politics in the Roman world influenced the development of the church, and in this case influenced the development of the power of, the position of the Bishop of Rome in both positive and negative ways. So we need to go back a little bit to the end of the 3rd century. This is a period of time when the Roman Empire is greatly expanded in terms of its size. Christianity is still illegal in this period. And near the end of the 3rd century, a Roman emperor named Diocletian looks at the empire and says, it's too big. This is the era before the internet. I was at the monastery of St. Paul the last few days, and when someone needed something, they got out their iPhone and called one of the other monks on the iPhone. You couldn't do this in 293. I couldn't send an email unless one of the monks set up a hotspot for me on his phone. Right? You couldn't do this. Diocletian could not do this. So he said, we need to divide the empire. So we have a map here looking at basically the Roman world at the time of Diocletian's reign. In fact, if it were historically accurate to Diocletian specifically, it would also include Britain. So you have an empire that stretches from the shores of Scotland down to Thebes, southern Egypt. It's a huge empire, really impossible to govern effectively given the limitations of communication at this time. So Diocletian has a solution. He divides the empire into 4 parts, developing what we call the tetrarchy, which means the rule by 4. And this sculpture, which is now in Venice, is believed by some historians to be a sculpture of the 4 leaders, the 2 leaders of the East and the 2 leaders of the West embracing each other. It's somewhat disputed by some scholars, but this may be what this is. So Diocletian divides the empire into 4 parts. He is the leader of the Eastern. He's the major leader of the Eastern half of the empire. He takes the title Augustus of the East, and under him is a fellow named Galerius. And if you know something about church history, Galerius is infamous as a persecutor of Christians. In the West, there's Maximianus, and under him, a sub-leader named Constantius Chlorus. And Constantius Chlorus, you may have never heard of him, but there's a good chance you've heard of his son, Constantine. So Diocletian divides the empire into 4 parts to make it easier to administer. If we come back to this map of the empire and see it divided, we can see the 4 different parts. The brown representing the western edge. You have this green section in the middle, which includes Rome, a purple section here, and then over in the east, a kind of a lighter shade of purple. These are the 4 divisions of the Roman Empire. And there's something very important that I want us to notice about them. If you notice where the Eastern and Western empires are split, this is not by accident. It's not just geographical. This is a cultural and even a linguistic split. The regions in the western half of the empire are Latin-speaking, including Italy, Spain, Gaul, all across North Africa. These are Latin-speaking regions. The eastern half of the empire is Greek-speaking. So beginning in Greece, all the way across Asia Minor, eventually over to the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, across the north coast of Africa. These are Greek-speaking regions. So the empire is divided into 4 parts. The major division is Western Latin-speaking versus Eastern Greek-speaking. This political division is to determine, in many ways, the eventual course of the church itself. And if you're already thinking about the Latin church and the Greek church, you're on the right track, because this is exactly what eventually happens. And this political division sets the stage for that, sets the circumstances in which that's eventually going to happen. Now, let's come back to Rome. When Diocletian establishes these 4 divisions, the capital of the part that includes Rome is not in Rome. The capital of the region of the empire that includes Rome is actually in Milan, in northern Italy. So at this period of time when the empire is divided, Rome is already beginning to lose some of its authority. Politically, Rome is no longer the capital of its own region. A city that was the capital of the entire Mediterranean world is now not even the capital of its own region within the Mediterranean world. In the year 330, Rome's place takes another hit when the Emperor Constantinople founds a new city. Well, he refounds a city. There was an old city there. He refounds it as his new capital, Constantinople, which means Constantine's city. So he built the city and named it after himself. And Constantinople is quickly recognized as a kind of new Rome. This is another blow to Rome's position. It's no longer the capital of its own region, and now there's a new Rome that is a capital city, that does have the imperial palace in it. The position of Rome is increasingly being decreased by political factors. In the year 404, the capital's moved from Milan, not to Rome, but now the capital's moved to Ravenna, another northern Italian city, because Ravenna is on the eastern coast and it's quicker to get to the east by ship from Ravenna. So now Rome has seen the capital move twice, and in neither case has the capital come back to Rome itself. And then soon after that, in the year 410, the city of Rome is attacked by the Visigoths and it's sacked. They sack the city, they invade the city, and when this happens, who is there to defend the Romans? Almost no one. Almost no one. Rome is no longer a capital city. The imperial government that exists in this part of the empire is located in Ravenna. No one is there. Rome's political situation is decreasing. It's being increasingly marginalized and pushed to the edge of the empire. 40 years later, Rome has another aggressive visitor, one of the most infamous of all the ancient invaders, Attila the Hun. Attila the Hun comes to the walls of Rome in the year 452. Who meets Attila and his army of Huns at the wall of the city? The emperor? Certainly not. The general? No. It's the bishop. The bishop is the only one left. Because in the structure of the Roman Empire, the army has largely withdrawn from Rome. So who is there? The bishop goes out to meet Attila because there is no one else. So on the one hand, we see the decrease in Rome's position within the empire, and because other things that the empire used to do, like protect the city, like provide material goods to the people, like giving benefits to the people, because the government is no longer doing these things, the bishop is stepping into that gap and is beginning to fill more roles. And as the bishop fills more roles, his power begins to expand. He's doing more, he's being recognized further. There's a famous painting of this meeting between Attila and Leo. And if you look at the painting here on the left-hand side, you see Leo, identifiable because of his very large hat. And in the middle here is Attila, who is withdrawing. He's kind of shying away. Why is he shying away? Because he's afraid of Leo? No, because a later tradition said that when Leo went out to meet Attila, he didn't go out alone. He took Peter and Paul with him. So when the bishop of Rome comes to the walls of the city to meet Attila, he comes alone, except that Peter and Paul are hovering above him carrying swords, and Attila is frightened by Peter and Paul and withdraws. He comes back later and attacks the city, but on this occasion he withdraws. The bishop is the only one left, and so his power, his influence is expanding within Rome itself. So there are political factors. But there are also some factors within the church itself, some ecclesiastical factors that lead to the growth and the expansion of the power of the Bishop of Rome. And again, some of these, as with the political situation, some of these factors are negative for Rome, but end up being positive for the bishop at the end of the day. Isolation. the isolation of the West. I referred a few minutes ago to the arrival of military forces to Rome, and there's no one there to stop them. The Roman Church was also increasingly isolated. And if we look at evidence from the church councils and other events in the 4th and 5th century, we can see this. So in 325, Constantine calls a worldwide church council to meet in Nicaea. The Bishop of Rome, Sylvester I, is not there. He does send a few of his representatives, but they're very few in number. In fact, the sources tell us that there were 318 bishops at the Council of Nicaea. That's an approximate. 314 of them were from the East, the Greek-speaking East. 4 of them were from the West, which gives you an indication of, at the Council of Nicaea, what's the power of Rome in the church as a whole? 4 versus 314. Between the councils, there's an event that happens that also gives us this picture of the isolation of the West. In the year 341, there's a new church dedicated in Antioch. And at the dedication of the church in Antioch, there's a large gathering of bishops. And Julius, the Bishop of Rome, writes a letter to Antioch and says, I'm glad you're having a meeting. That's really wonderful. But now come to Rome for a council. And he says, you know, we're the city of Peter and Paul. Peter and Paul died here, so come to Rome and listen to what I have to say. Julius really wants to exercise some authority over them. The bishops write back and say, no thank you, we're not interested in coming. And in fact, they say, you talk about Peter and Paul, well, let us remind you, Julius, that Peter and Paul preached in Antioch before they went to Rome. So if you want to say the city that claims Peter and Paul claims authority, we have more authority than you do, because they were here before they came to Rome. So Rome is increasingly isolated from the rest of the church. In 381, at the Second Ecumenical Council in Constantinople, Bishop Damasus, who was very powerful within Rome, is not present, is not consulted. And in the following year, he writes a letter to the Eastern bishops and says, I've heard what you did in the council, that's wonderful. Now come to Rome. Come to Rome and we'll have another meeting that I will oversee, and we'll agree. We'll make sure that you've done everything the right way. And they ignore him. Increasing isolation of the Western Church. Now structurally, so we see in the councils the presence or absence of the Bishop of Rome, but structurally we also see the isolation of the Western Church and of Rome in particular. In the ancient church, there were originally 4 patriarchs. 4 patriarchs, 4 churches that were considered to have a little more authority than the others. And they were Rome in the west, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria. These were the 4 great patriarchs, the 4 greatest of the bishops in many ways. Constantine added a 5th with Constantinople. So now we have 5 patriarchs. 4 of them are in the Greek-speaking world. 4 of them we see over and over and over again have influence on what happens at church councils. Certainly we see Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, Jerusalem. They're very influential, very involved in what happens in church councils to decide elements of Christology, talking about who God is, who was Christ. The Church of Rome far less involved in these activities.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Was this a reflection of the size of the church?
So the question is this a reflection of the size of the church in terms of where the patriarchs are established? As far as we can tell, it's not a direct reflection of that, because Carthage is a very large city with a very large church. But Carthage never is never considered a patriarch. So there does seem to be, I think it's the apostolic connection is a lot with Jerusalem, Antioch, and apostolic traditions related to Alexandria. And then later with Constantinople, one of the things that Constantine tries to do to give it apostolic authority is he builds a church of the holy apostles, and he's trying to bring all the relics of the apostles to Constantinople. So it seems to be the apostolic connection that establishes the patriarchs, and Rome through Peter and Paul.
So what happened in Constantinople?
So what happened in Chalcedon with the Bishop of Rome? Yes, this is one case where the Bishop of Rome, he writes a letter Well, your question is what happens in Chalcedon. It's a very good question. Different people have different understandings of what happens. So Leo I writes a letter. And by some accounts, Leo's letter provides the answer to the problem. Leo's wording provides the solution to the problem. Now, Leo's writing in Latin. So how does Leo writing in Latin provide the solution for a council in Greek, in which really you have a difference of one letter in Greek is the difference between the two primary perspectives at the Council of Chalcedon. So how is Leo's letter providing a solution to that? Those who consider themselves in the tradition of Chalcedon may say Leo's letter provides the solution. Those who reject Chalcedon within the Christian tradition would say Leo's letter is a distortion, and the church makes a mistake by following Leo's letter. So it's unclear how much influence Leo's letter actually has. Maybe it has some, but what exactly is he saying, and is it a good thing or not? Those are questions that really in church history are still debated in many ways. But certainly Leo does see himself as having the authority to write. It's not clear if he actually does have that authority in reality or not. So we have a power vacuum in the West, and we have isolation in the West. And so the Bishop of Rome practically begins to do things that government officials used to do. There's an expansion of power out of necessity. It's not uncommon, at least in parts of the West, to hear about Roman Catholic conspiracies, that early on the Roman Catholic Church conspired to suppress this book, or so conspired to do that, or the Pope conspired to do this. I don't see the development of the papacy as some kind of conspiracy. I don't think it was planned. I think the Bishop of Rome saw huge gaps, huge needs, and began to fill in those needs. And as a result of that, his power expanded. If you had asked a bishop in the 3rd century, how are you going to get control of the entire Western Church? I don't think he would know. I don't think he would know how to do this. But historical elements, led to the expansion of the power of the bishop. So who is the first pope? Most historians, and I would agree with this, would say that Leo I is the first bishop we can look at and say, he seems to look like a pope in terms of unquestioned authority, seemingly in the Western Church. He's the one who meets Attila at the gates of Rome. He's the one who writes a letter to Chalcedon, who seems to think, I as the Bishop of Rome have the authority to write to the Eastern bishops and tell them what to do. Whether they thought he did or not, he seems to think that he had that kind of authority. And really, beginning with the time of Leo and afterwards, we begin to see the Pope and the Church not just having authority of ecclesiastical issues, of sacred issues, but also of political issues. So over the course of these centuries, we see in many ways what I would call the fall of the Bishop of Rome, as Rome is increasingly isolated from the rest of the church and politically and economically. And then we have the rise of the Bishop of Rome, where the Bishop of Rome begins to fill in these gaps and do things that others used to do. And out of that develops a bishop in Rome who's much more powerful, I would say, than in earlier centuries, who has control over many more elements of life than earlier bishops did, and who in later centuries is going to exert that authority over the Western Church in a way that in the 1st or 2nd or 3rd or 4th century I don't think is possible. And certainly the Eastern churches have never accepted the special authority of the Western bishop. And I would say we see the example of Cyprian in the last lecture. There were others in the West who also questioned this for quite a long time. Beginning in the 5th century onward, it appears that the Bishop of Rome finally has achieved this position of having, in some ways, unquestioned authority, until the Middle Ages, when kings are going to begin to push back and to question the authority of the Bishop of Rome as the Pope. But in thinking about Africa, if you're the Bishop of Carthage, the Bishop of Rome is there, and what he thinks he has the authority to do may influence you. We'll see how Cyprian engages sometimes in a positive way, sometimes in a critical way with the things that are happening in Rome. We'll see how Tertullian engages, sometimes critically with what's happening in Rome. We'll see how the Donatists engage with what's happening in Rome. And over the centuries, we see this expansion of the power of the bishop. Any questions about these later centuries in the development of the papacy and where the papacy comes from?
So would you say that the role of the Pope developed basically because he stepped into a situation of crisis?
So the question is, would I say the role of the Pope developed because he stepped into a situation of crisis? That is my understanding. Speaking historically, that's my understanding of it. It's not, I don't think it was vindictive or manipulative. I think this is a series of bishops who really saw a need in their culture. And who's going to step in? If anything, in our modern period, a fair critique of the church is that the church has backed away and is letting the government do things that the church should be doing. And maybe in this period we see the opposite. We see the church having to do things that the government has stopped.